Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with this next work session. Oops, let me pull it up. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding AO 2022-98 and AR 2022-328, amending Title 28, Elections, and the Election Observers Handbook. It is Friday, November 18, 2022. We are scheduled from 1:30 to 3 p.m. today. It is 1:31, and we will go ahead and start with Assembly member introductions for the record.
Pete Peterson, Daniel Volant.
Suzanne LaFrance, and on the phone we have Ms. Zelatel.
Yes.
Thank you. Are there any other members who are on the phone? No. And at the table, we also have
Jamie Hines, Election Administrator.
Oh. Should I say that again? DNS Legal Counsel.
Dean Gates, Assembly Council.
Robert Jones, Municipal Clerk.
Thank you. Appreciate you all being here today. I want to note for the record that Ms. Allard, Mr. Constant, Ms. Quinn Davidson, and Mr. Dunbar are excused. And with that, I will turn to Ms. Hines to go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you so much. I thought I would start today. We'll just jump right in with the ordinance AO 2022-98. This is an omnibus ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending and updating Anchorage Municipal Code Title 28 elections. And I will go through section by section, just giving a brief note about what the change, or giving the change and a brief note about what it does. So section 1 is AMC 2810-020, the powers and duties of the municipal clerk. And it's adding in the election administrator and specifying that the election administrator manages elections under the direction of the municipal clerk. And if anybody has questions, you can grab my attention as we go, but I will keep plugging along unless I hear questions. Section 2 is on page 2 of the ordinance. It's 2810-040 definitions. And here we are amending the definition of signature. This clarifies the definition of signature so that it is no longer circular. It used to include the word mark, which is used in many contexts throughout Title 28. And so we're ultimately adding a definition of mark in necessary sections later in the ordinance. Section 3 is also on page 2. It is 2820-015. This is time for passage of ballot propositions. We're putting in a little time extension here, which would allow for a veto override or reconsideration vote if necessary. The timeframes for passage of ballot propositions were set up at a time when MOA was required to obtain DOJ preclearance under the Voters' Rights Act for ballot propositions. And this requirement no longer applies, and we were able to extend the deadline just a bit to allow for a veto override or reconsideration vote. Section 4, I think, is on page 3. It's 2820-040. The notice of election, including notice of polling locations or vote centers and notice of bonded indebtedness. It requires that the first notice of election be given 51 days prior to the election. And this is a companion amendment to Section 3, which would delay the first notice of election by 1 week to allow the time for the veto, override, or reconsideration vote. Section 5 is on page 3. I should have written this down. It's the video viewing of election processes at the designated return location. This section now defines the election process timeline and sets a standard for the clerk to provide live streaming. It more clearly defines the timeline for when election processes are taking place for the purposes of live streaming and sets the standard of best efforts for the clerk to use when providing the live streaming. Section 6 starts on page 3, but ultimately is on page 4, and it is 2850-030, appointment privileges of observers. No. Yeah, it's a simple typo correction. The typo correction was in the citation of where a recount can be found in the code. It had the wrong chapter. In section 7, which is on page 4, 2870-030 A1E and A2C1, the ballot return envelope review standards regular allows the election commission to meet only once instead of twice. This change makes the deadline for the receipt of military and overseas ballots the same as all other mailed ballot envelopes. Voters have been given an extension by moving the public session of canvass meeting to the 3rd week of April instead of the 2nd, which was past practice, making this additional extension no longer necessary. This would allow the election commission to meet only once instead of twice. And as a practical matter, in 2021, in both elections, in 2022, I apologize, no military and overseas ballots were received between the first public session of canvass and the second, and the certification. And so it had only been enacted for 1 year, and so we didn't have any of those types of ballots. Also in section 7, AMC 2870-030 A2A and AC5, the ballot return, it's still the ballot return envelope review standards regular, introduces and expands the definition of mark. It introduces and expands the definition of mark when used by a voter who is unable to sign. And also in 2870-030 subsection E, the ballot review return envelope standards, another code citation correction. This one correctly cites the provisions for cure letter requirements. And finally, section 8, 2880-050 rules for counting votes. This codifies the Election Commission's interpretation of voter intent, which we saw in 2022. What was commonly challenged by observers to adjudication of votes was the X's, and observers challenged those, and those challenges were granted by the Election Commission, and so we're entering them into the code so that there's no question for the future. And that sums up the ordinance, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Anyone have any questions? Ms. Hines, I know that we have talked about this before. I'm just looking at that section on page 6 regarding the strike-throughs. And so this graphic would be in code.
Correct. The first and second examples, the first race and the first proposition, are already an image in code, and then the third and fourth examples are newly added, so the second race and proposition will be newly added by this ordinance.
Okay, and all these are examples of valid votes where a voter has struck through one of the lines. And this was recommended by the commission?
Correct. The election, there were several challenges to votes in the third and fourth examples by the observers. And when we took them to the election commission, they granted those challenges. And so because observers and election commission members interpreted the voter to vote that way, then we decided to put it in code so that there was no question and we would adjudicate them that way going forward.
Great, thank you so much. I think that makes a lot of sense to put that in there. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think obviously the reason that this was done is because they could ascertain what the voter's intent was. And so as long as they're able to figure out what their intent was, the vote should be counted. And so the object is to count as many votes as possible. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Okay, I think we can
Any
continue
other
on.
questions? And we will move along to the resolution. So the resolution on page 6 of 35, and the actual handbook is in there twice. One of them is the red line version, and the other one is a clean version, as if all of the amendments would be adopted. And so on page 6 of 35, we're correcting the spelling of the word principal. On page
It's not the principal that's your pal.
right.
It's the other principal.
Right. On page 7 of 35, under about observers, it foreshadows the expansion of the complaint and suggestion process, which I'll fully describe later, but there's just a tiny little edit there. On page 8 of 35, under observer registration, we are simplifying the observer registration process. It provides that the municipal clerk, election administrator, or designee will be signing the observer's badges instead of the candidate or campaign manager. And that will eliminate extra trips for the candidate or election or campaign manager back and forth to the election center at a time that's busy for them as well. Pages 16 and 17 of 35, the title is Observer Concerns with Election Administration and Management. Provides a new section which discusses election administration and management concerns. Here we are expanding the complaint and suggestion process by identifying that certain concerns can be handled informally and with suggestions. And administration and management concerns, which are not resolved by the municipal clerk or election administrator, would change the outcome of the election if found to be true, may be renewed to the election commission by submitting the concern on a new form entitled Election Commission Failure to Comply with Law or Illegal Election Practices.
And I just want to note for the record that we have been joined by Mr. Saltz on the phone.
Thank you.
Could I add one thing? The suggestions could be very, very minor. They would like a sign to be here instead of there, different ways of storing boxes. And so we wanted to have a more informal process and calling it a complaint with a formal answer. And that the election staff was very open to these suggestions. But they were really very minor suggestions about management of operations.
And then page 17 of 35, election official conduct and misconduct. It changes the complaint process to require a citation to applicable provisions of Anchorage Municipal Code, which were not followed. And it expands the complaint process by recognizing that some complaints are handled informally, as we've just given an example of. and then complaints that are not resolved by the municipal clerk or election administrator and would change the outcome of the election if found to be true may be renewed to the election commission by submitting the concern on that new election commission failure to comply with law form. And that wraps up all of the brief explanation of all of the changes.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what was the reason? Was there something that happened in one of the most recent elections that we made that last change?
In the last election, there were many complaints submitted, and we formally responded to, I believe the number was 40-something complaints, which was really time-consuming. And so our hope here is to try to handle them informally if we can. And then it didn't seem to be clear to the observers that if they weren't satisfied with our response, then they would renew them to the election commission. And so I believe it was the day before or a few days before the election commission, there was, we explained it to them, and then it caused a lot of work on their behalf to do it in a short period of time to get the renewed complaints brought to us to be put in the packet for the election commission. So by giving them this form, they can fill it out in advance.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Any other questions? I don't have anyone else in the queue. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Hines and Ms.
Yeah.
Ennis. Appreciate
you.
you walking us through the ordinance and the proposed changes to the handbook.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we made significant changes and spent a significant amount of time last year, and had several meetings with people who had been observers, and we're trying to figure out what best practices would work best for them and us as well. And so the number of changes this year are considerably less. And so I was actually surprised when this was scheduled for an hour and a half. I thought we'd probably be done in half that time or less. And so I think we are. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I think that's a great point. You all have worked so hard, for several years to address all these issues, and so many changes were made to the Observer program and those materials. So thank you for your attention to those details and all that hard work. I think you're right, Mr. Peterson. It's really reflected in how few changes there are in this year's annual review. And I have not been receiving too many follow-up questions either. We've been raising this at community councils at the annual review. Has been underway, and they'll just note that the public hearing for this item is on Tuesday, on the 22nd, the regular meeting, and the intent of leadership is to continue that public hearing to the regular meeting of December 6th, so that there will be those two options for folks to testify in person or by phone. And of course, members of the public are always invited to submit email testimony as well. Ms. Hines?
And I would also just add to let you guys know that we invited, we let all 80 registered observers from the 2022 elections. We sent the draft ordinance and resolution to everyone and informed them of this work session and of the two public hearings. So hopefully the word is out there.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. Anything else from anybody? Thank you again for being here today and for all your work. hopefully I will see everyone and more and a few other folks at our next meeting, our next work session at 3:10. That one will be on Title 21 parking requirements. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.